They had no hope. How could they? The people of Judah were dead, about to be dead anyway. They knew how this was going to unfold, how it had unfolded for their neighbors just a few generations ago. Israel, the northern half of the old kingdom of David, had been conquered by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE. The Assyrians had moved new people in, installed new residents in Israelite homes and new leaders in the Israelite capital, people who didn't speak Hebrew or worship God. The Israelites were deported to Assyria. No one heard from them again. They'd eventually be called the lost tribes of Israel. The Israelite nation was dead, never to live again. The people of Judah, the southern half of David's kingdom, were waiting for the same fate. It was a different empire now, Babylon, not Assyria, but the strategy and the result were the same. In 597 BCE, the Babylonians conquered Judah and deported most of its leaders, the king, the priests at the temple in Jerusalem, off to Babylon. The Judahites who were left at home plotted rebellion, and 10 years later, they rose up against the empire. Babylon put Jerusalem under siege for a year and a half, and when the starving city finally fell, the Babylonians burned it and demolished the temple. The surviving members of the royal family were killed. There would be no more kings in David's line. The rest of Judah's elite were deported to Babylon. Strangers, foreigners moved in to replace them. It was the end of Judah. 2 wars, the siege, the famine, the deportations, the destruction of everything that made them who they were, and they were dead as their lost neighbors in Israel. Among the first wave of exiles in 597 was a young man called Ezekiel. He was one of the elite. He'd been preparing to be a priest in Jerusalem. When he was deported, that future died. But the temple was still there. God was still being worshiped, and Ezekiel could hold on to that. Then the temple was destroyed. The world as Ezekiel knew it was ended. The trauma and grief and loss were shattering. Ezekiel and the exiles tried to explain why this had happened to them. Maybe Judah had broken the covenant with God. Maybe they'd brought this on themselves by worshiping other gods and ignoring the needs of the poor. Maybe Babylon's God had defeated Judah's God. Maybe God was gone, in hiding, or refusing to act. It seemed to the exiles that Judah had been abandoned. Not even God had helped them. Not long after the fall of Jerusalem, when the magnitude of loss became clear to the exiles in Babylon, Ezekiel has a vision. The Spirit of God, the breath, the wind, it's all the same word in Hebrew, brings Ezekiel into a valley. Whatever had happened here, it was a great catastrophe. Thousands had died, and there was no one left to bury them. God leads Ezekiel all around the valley to see the full extent of this. Bones are everywhere, piled up in the stream beds, scattered under the trees. They've been bleached white by the sun. They've been lying here a long time. God asks Ezekiel, "Mortal, can these bones live?" Ezekiel knows they can't. There's no way these dry, dead bones can live. But he also knows that God's ways are not mortal ways. So he says only, "God, you know." And God commands Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones. Say to them, I will put sinews and muscle and skin on you. I shall cause breath, wind, spirit to enter you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So Ezekiel prophesies to the bones, repeats God's words to them. For a long moment, all is silent. The only sound is the echo of Ezekiel's words. Then off in the distance, there is a faint rattle. It gets louder and closer and louder and closer. The dry, dead bones are moving. Phalanges and tarsals and metatarsals fit together. Columns of vertebrae restack themselves. Radius and ulna reattach. Ligaments and tendons follow. Then deltoids and biceps. Then skin and hair and fingernails. A vast multitude now lies before Ezekiel. It is creepy as all get out, watching skeletons assemble and become people again, or something like it, but they aren't breathing. It's like Night of the Living Dead in the valley. Ezekiel is kind of freaked out. Wouldn't you be? He wonders what God is doing here. And then a moment of grace, a moment of pure gift when everything becomes possible. God says to Ezekiel, prophesy to the breath. Come from the four winds and breathe wind, spirit upon these that they may live. Ezekiel gets hold of himself and prophesies as God commands. For a moment again, all is silent. Then, off in the distance, there is a faint whoosh. It gets louder and closer and louder and closer. The wind, the spirit, the breath blows over the bodies, filling their nostrils, forcing air into their lungs. One body exhales in response, and then another and another and another until the valley is full of the sound of moving air. The bodies get to their feet. They begin to laugh and talk and sing. The spirit has made all the difference. The lumps of bone and sinew and flesh are now alive. The spirit, the breath, the wind has given life, as it did at the creation of the world. God has to shout to be heard over the chatter now. And God says to Ezekiel, mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel, the house of Judah. Your bones are dried up. You are cut off from each other and from me. You are buried in the grave and you have no hope. So prophesy to Judah. Tell them that I will open your graves and raise you up and bring you back to your own land. I will put my spirit within you, and your dry bones will live, and you will know that I am the Lord. It is the answer Ezekiel hadn't dared to hope for. God has not abandoned Judah or forgotten them. God's spirit is rushing towards the dry bones of Judah on the wind to blow breath into them and restore them to life. And the exiles are brought to life. First, while they are still in Babylon. Instead of waiting around for Judah to die, they turn exile into a time of remarkable creativity and renewal. They write new psalms and prayers. They learn their history anew and use it to envision a different future. They learn how to worship God and be Jewish outside of Jerusalem. Judaism becomes a worldwide religion because of those years in Babylon. And the wind from God blows the exiles back home, back to Judah. They build houses and live in them. They plant vines and eat their own grapes. They rebuild the temple and worship God in Jerusalem again. The Spirit, the breath, the wind makes it all possible. The flesh may be mostly dead. The Spirit gives life. The last 14 months have been a kind of exile for us. We haven't been cast out exactly, but we have been separated from places and people that gave our lives meaning. We have had to reinvent pretty much everything. The big things like virtual school and working from home, the little things like curbside pickup and birthday parties over Zoom. For a long time, we didn't know when this would end. We still don't know exactly when things will return to something like normal. For some of us, the pandemic brain fog is real. My memory seems to be about a quarter of what it used to be. I've heard from others that they are more tired than they have ever been, but they can't sleep. At times over this last year, or perhaps now, we might feel like dry bones, as scattered and sun-bleached as the bones in Ezekiel's valley. Yet the Spirit, the breath, the wind of God is blowing through us. The same Spirit Jesus promised to send to guide us into all the truth. The same Spirit that fell upon the 11 disciples and gave them the power to speak different languages. That Spirit is gathering us back together for worship, reassembling us like the bones in the valley. The Spirit is blowing fourth graders from all over Worthington to us for summer camp reading. The Spirit is pushing us out into the world to share the good news of God's unshakable love at the farmers market, in our schools and neighborhoods and workplaces. This is pure grace that can't be earned or deserved. It is God's gift to us. So we rejoice on this Pentecost Sunday, for the Spirit blows through our dry bones, renewing us and giving us life.